please welcome James Pepper Henry.
Thank you. Aho, kuya, kage nika kage wako, and I'm Jim Pepper Henry. I'm a member of the Kaw Nation of Oklahoma. I'm also vice chairman of my tribe, so in tribal politics, I don't know if I want to do that again after running, but it's been a great experience so far. And I'm also director of First Americans Museum. How many of you have been to the new museum? Just down the street, really, down 235. Not very many of you. You need to come, and I'm going to try to convince you to come today. First Americans Museum, we opened just about 6 weeks ago, September 18th, and this museum has been 30 years in the making. It started in the mid-1990s. The design of the museum was completed in around 1998, 1999, and ground was broken on the museum in 2006. And a lot of things have happened, and some of you have followed the saga of this museum. But originally this was a vision of the state of Oklahoma from out of their tourism department, because a lot of people at that time felt that the Native American story was not being told here in Oklahoma. We have the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum here in Oklahoma City, a lot of other museums that have Native collections, but there wasn't a centralized place to talk about the 39 tribal nations that are here in Oklahoma today. And so as it was being envisioned, it was thought to be a place to bring in tourists from all over the world. Europeans are fascinated with Native American culture and heritage. But several things happened along the way. This pressures on the state budget forced the state to pull funding in 2012. The shell of the building was built at that point in time, and it sat for 6 years empty. And luckily the HVAC system was running in the museum during that time, so it kept the interior in pretty good shape. And I was at Gilcrease Museum, director there, one of the great American art museums in the country, and helping Gilcrease re-envision their museum. We raised over $100 million to build a new Gilcrease, and that's it's happening now, actually. But at that time, a lot of the tribes got together and said, look, this is something we need to finish. We need a place to tell our stories, our histories, from our perspective, and we can't just let this go. And so I was brought on in 2017. You may know of a man named Governor Bill Anatubby of the Chickasaw Nation, and I met with him, and he was kind of the lead among the tribes to try to get this project going again. And a lot of negotiations happened between the state and the city of Oklahoma City and the tribes, and finally we got the green light to go again. And I came aboard this project for many reasons. One, I'm a member of two tribes here in Oklahoma, or at least enrolled member of one of two tribes and a descendant of another. So this museum was very personal to me, a place that I knew that we could tell our stories from our perspective. And so I came aboard and I looked at the plans of the museum, and again, the design goes all the way back to 1998, and I saw the plans, and of course all the lighting was incandescent lighting. LED lighting hadn't really come on at that point in time. The iPhone, the mobile phone, didn't exist back then, and I remember looking at the plans and looking in the lobby, and there by the restrooms there was a bank of payphones in the design, and I thought, well, we need to upgrade a few things inside the museum. And so we changed those payphones into water bottle filling stations. So if you come today, bring your water bottle, you can get water there at the water bottle filling station. But anyway, we made a lot of changes to the interior, and I can give a whole presentation on the things we've done, including bringing in native cuisine. I don't know how you can experience any culture, especially when you travel, without experiencing the cuisine of those cultures. And when we think of traditional Native American food, we think of fry bread and Indian tacos. That is not traditional food. That is post-commodity food. That is food that was imposed upon us by our federal government. We adapted to it, but we are reclaiming our food sovereignty at First Americans Museum. We have a wonderful Native chef. Her name is Loretta Barrett Oden. She's Citizen Potawatomi. And we are developing recipes, and our food's fantastic, based on traditional foods. And you've heard of from farm to table concept. Well, we have from res to table at our museum. We try to source our foods directly from the tribes, and we have a great relationship with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribe. They have their own bison herd now, and a commercial herd, and so we're sourcing our bison meat from Cheyenne and Arapaho. You will not find beef on our menu. You will not find chicken on our menu. Those are all colonial animals that were brought over by Europeans. We have bison on our menu. We have turkey on our menu. We even have salmon on our menu because some of our tribes come from areas around the country where there was salmon. So, incredible menu. Our museum store, we've made a commitment to support our native artists here in Oklahoma. We have incredible talent among our tribes with our artists, but there isn't a great market here in Oklahoma for those types of items, and they go away to Santa Fe or to Scottsdale, Arizona. So we're trying to bring our artists back here to Oklahoma and featuring the great talent that we have in our museum store. Just to give you an example, when I was at Gilcrease Museum, we grossed about $350,000 a year in our museum store at Gilcrease. Well, by promoting and featuring our native artists, already we've grossed over $250,000 in the first 5 weeks that we've been open. People have a hunger for authentic, one-of-a-kind, handmade native items, and we've already gone through a couple cycles of reordering from our native artists already. So we're a huge part of that economy, and we're supporting our native artists that way. So I encourage you to come to the museum and experience the talented artists that we have and the great cuisine. But I want to talk about our exhibits a little bit, and one in particular. And of course, we're located literally at the crossroads of America, the intersection of I-35 and I-40. 120,000 cars drive right by our site every day. So it is a great location for tourism, but we've kind of flipped the narrative a little bit, and I think a lot of people, when they first envisioned our museum, they thought, oh, we'll just have a little cultural center with Indians on display, dancing and so forth, and that is not the direction that we went with our museum. A little bit about what we're about. First Americans Museum represents the 39 tribal nations, 37 of whom were removed from traditional homelands around the contiguous United States. And we used to call Oklahoma Indian Territory, and I think that's a friendly way of saying this was one of the largest internment camps ever in the history of the world. This was one of the largest forced migration and ethnic cleansings of people in our history, and certainly in the Western Hemisphere. There was a complete ethnic cleansing of the American Southeast. All those tribes were removed to Oklahoma. This was not meant to be a playland for Native Americans. American Indians were meant to stay in Indian territory and not go anywhere. And there's a whole story about Chief Standing Bear, one of the first civil rights cases, where he left Oklahoma to go back to Nebraska, where the Ponca people were from, and the federal government was trying to force him back into Oklahoma, but he won his case, and that's another story. But I want people to understand this, that the story of Oklahoma is the story of the United States and how the United States was formed. And to give you an example, what happened here in Oklahoma is the equivalent of moving every country in Europe to a place the size of England, not necessarily in terms of population, but in terms of cultural lifeway, diversity in cultural lifeways, in languages, in beliefs. It was like moving somebody from Romania and people from Sweden and people from Spain into one place and expecting everybody to get along and understand each other. Our communities, our native communities here in Oklahoma, are just as diverse from each other as the countries are in Europe. And when we sat down to think about how we were going to tell our story, there was one thing that was very important to us, that our history of Native Americans is not told by Native Americans. It's told by the dominant society who have subjugated us. And so we said right out of the gate, we are going to tell our histories from our perspective in our first-person voices. And it's never been done on this scale before. Even at the Smithsonian Institution, only 9% of the staff are Native American. I'm proud to say I have a 100% Native curatorial team, 11 of us. In fact, John Hamilton was mentioned in the program, in the presentation earlier. He was on my team. And we are telling our stories the way we understand our history which you're not going to get in the history books anywhere in Oklahoma or anywhere in the country, from our first person indigenous voices. And I was really worried about how people were going to react to our stories once we opened, but our story is a human story, and every human being has a story. And I think people are connecting to the humanity of our stories, the trials and tribulations that we've gone through, the forced removal from our homelands. You have to remember, Native Americans were 100% of the population in 1491. We are less than 1% of the population in 2021. So lost 99.9% of our population. So one of the things that we were very interested in was, and I used to work for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And while I was there, I discovered that thousands of objects were collected from the tribes in Oklahoma between 1909 and 1914. They were in this museum called the Museum of the American Indian. It was a private collection run by a man named George Gustav High. He, like many people from his time in the early 20th century, believed that native cultures would be extinct by the end of the 20th century. With forced assimilation, with the Allotment Act, the breaking up of tribal lands, for 4 generations our children were sent to government-run and Christian-run boarding schools, trying to eliminate our culture and our languages. And so he believed that Native American material culture, the items that we make, wouldn't be made anymore by the end of the 20th century because we wouldn't exist as a culture anymore, as cultural people. So he collected over 800,000 objects from tribes from not only the United States but throughout the Western Hemisphere. He was what they would call a boxcar collector. He didn't collect railroad boxcars, he filled railroad boxcars up with collections. And so he created this museum in New York City, 155th and Broadway, and he obviously couldn't go out and collect all these things by himself. So he sent surrogates out throughout the United States and the hemisphere, archaeologists and anthropologists, to collect these items from tribes. And if you know anything about the time period between 1909 and 1914, it was a devastating period for the tribes. Most of the tribes had lost their communal lands. A lot of tribes were forced into private ownership of property. And what happens when you own private property? You have to pay taxes. What happens if you can't pay your taxes? Well, the government will come in and take your land, and that's what happened to most of the American Indians. So whites ended up with the majority of native land through repossession because natives could not pay taxes on private land that was forced upon them. So Harrington came in at a very difficult time for the tribes, starvation, a lot of unemployment. And so he was able to collect a lot of these material items from the tribes for pennies on the dollar to help build this collection in New York City. So while I was there, I did some research, and I thought, and I knew about this museum being established, and I wrote a memorandum of agreement while I was at the Smithsonian to loan these collections back that were just sitting in the basement at the Smithsonian and bring them to Oklahoma to the new First Americans Museum. And this is me over here. I look like I'm 12 years old. This is in 2007, signing the memorandum of agreement to bring those objects back to Oklahoma. To make a long story short, George High, when he passed away in the 1950s, he established a foundation to fund his museum, but then over time that museum ran out of resources and the Smithsonian absorbed it in 1989. So this is the exhibit at First Americans Museum on the upper mezzanine level. And the amazing thing about this, we consulted all 39 tribes in Oklahoma. We showed them the lists of the objects that were collected from the tribes in Oklahoma, almost every tribe in Oklahoma, and we asked the tribes to select 3 objects from that list that we could bring back for a long-term loan. And usually the Smithsonian only loans collections for 12 or 13 weeks. Well, back in my ultimate wisdom, of course I didn't know I was going to be director of the museum 15 years later, but I made sure that this loan was a 10-year loan at least, and that we could rotate objects after 10 years. And so in our exhibit, it's called Winneco. Winneco, life of an object. And Winneco is a Caddo word which means the life force power in all things, even inanimate objects. And so a lot of our tribal peoples here in Oklahoma believe that these objects that were made over a century ago are imbued with a living spirit. And so it was very fascinating for the tribes to select these objects. But the incredible thing is, we had the purchase receipts from the gentleman that came and collected these objects, and we saw the family names on there. And so as these objects were being selected, we reached out to those families 4 generations later to connect those families with these objects that were taken. And it was the most incredible experience I think I've ever had. And you can see, here's a gentleman named Ed Red Eagle Jr. He's a member of the Osage Nation. This coat belonged to his great-grandfather, Henry Red Eagle, and he had no idea that this was in the collection there. And we were able to reunite him with that object. And the amazing thing is, there wasn't a lot of information about this object when it was collected, but he came in and he knew exactly, possibly who made this jacket, what the design patterns made, what ceremony it was worn in. And so by reconnecting these objects with the family members, we've just increased the knowledge base of this collection exponentially. Plus, it is inspiring the families and the tribes. When they see these design patterns they haven't seen in over a century, it's really inspiring the tribes to continue those design patterns. Here's another example. This is a breech cloth worn by a man named Ben Holloway, and we were able to track down his family. And you can see these are his granddaughters. This is Ben Holloway here. They came in as these objects were coming off the truck from the Smithsonian as we were opening the crates, and they got to see these objects for the very first time. And it was very emotional for the entire family, and getting to see this and touch this and feel this. And you could actually kind of feel these objects, that life force kind of being awoken with people interacting with these objects. And of course, they could tell us in detail all about these items, the iconography on these pieces, where before there was no record of any of that. One quick personal story. I know I'm over time. This is also in the exhibit. This is an otter collar. Well, in 1909, there was a delegation of Kaw Indians, and that's my tribe. They went to Washington to negotiate a treaty. Among this delegation was this very handsome man right here. This is my great-grandfather, James Pepper. And he was part of that delegation that went to Washington, D.C. And shortly after they returned from D.C. to Oklahoma, that collector came through and collected some items from my tribe. And this gentleman right here next to my great-grandfather, his name is Mahuji. That means gray blanket in our language. And you can see he's wearing this otter collar. And if you're a member of the Kaw Nation, most Kaw families have this. It's a famous portrait, and it usually is on our living room walls. And no matter what family you go to, they have a picture of this. And so I've been staring at this picture my entire life, and I saw that otter collar. And when I was at the Smithsonian, I recognized that. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it said it was the collector had collected that from Mahuji in 1909, about 2 months after the Kaw delegation had come back from Oklahoma. And so I know the family very well, the Mahuji family. I called them up, and this is Bill Mahuji. He's the grandson of that man sitting in that picture, and I invited him to come to the museum, and he got to see the item that his grandfather wore. And the cool thing is, I'm in the picture too, and so it was my great-grandfather and his grandfather together, and this kind of reunited us in a way in our families too. So, but the point I'm trying to make here is that all of these objects have a story. They have a connection to real people. And most museums you go to, you'll just see an object on display, and it'll say it's a Kiowa headdress, and it has 47 feathers in it, and it has nice beadwork. And that's about all you're going to get out of these objects. We're connecting real people with these objects, and it's been incredible. And in January, the Smithsonian will be back. We're not allowed to open the cases unless Smithsonian's present as part of our agreement. When they come back, we're going to reunite hopefully another 8 or 10 families with the objects that are on display, and then be able to share that knowledge. And again, I hope all of you can come to First Americans Museum and experience what we have there. That's just one little story out of many stories that we have that we're telling at First Americans Museum. So thank you very much.